What's up, everybody? This is Dylan,
And this is Gavin.
and welcome to episode 2 of the Millennial Button Mashers podcast, the podcast where we try to convey our love of video games in a casual, armchair-like approach, meaning we're just talking about video games that we love and feel like deserve some extra attention. Keep in mind, this podcast is purely our opinions. You're going to disagree, and that's completely okay. What we want to do here is just promote some healthy conversation around video games, and again, talk about the things that we want to talk about. But we want to hear your feedback as well. So in the comments, feel free to put anything specific you'd like for us to talk about in the future, or if you have any color commentary about what we talk about today. For today's episode, though, we want to go through our own journeys with video games, starting with the video games and consoles that we feel define the eras of our lives so far. And for the next 3 episodes, we'll follow this format. This episode is going to be our 10 years and under era. We're also going to be talking about early teenage years and high school years in another episode. And then we'll talk about the collegiate years as well as going into adult life, the video games that we feel shaped that era for us. And if you're a T-Swift fan, you should feel right at home with this Eras Tour style episode. But before we jump in, make sure to subscribe for more content as we will be posting brand new content every other week. And with that, let's go ahead and jump in, friends. All right, Gavin, our second episode of the Millennial Button Mashers podcast. I think it's always interesting to hear what our journey has been like for video games and the consoles that shaped us into the people that we are, especially as gamers, because as you know, they're a very diverse group of gaming individuals in the community. And I think when we talked in our first episode, we did cover some of the video games that really got us into the gaming ecosystem, but I don't think that tells the full story of what keeps us playing now. But before we go into that, let's jump through quickly to talk about the consoles of this childhood era that we're going to talk about and the games that we felt were influential in those time periods. And Gavin, I just have to say, I think we were very blessed with what we had access to as kids. And when I was doing research for this episode, there were just a lot of things I was like, oh my gosh, I want to go back and play that, or something of that nature that I feel like we were just eating good, to be completely transparent during this time period. So,
I mean, obviously it's a bit of nostalgia talking, but at the same time, they're great games. They're getting remade every 5 years for a reason, you know?
exactly, which we'll have to talk about in a future episode too, remasters and remakes and how prevalent those are too. But before we jump into any of these timelines here, what we'll do just to frame our conversation today is we'll talk a little bit about what came out in the early 90s and from a console perspective, and then we'll jump into and springboard into conversations about the games of that console that we feel like were influential for us. So the first one is the SNES, or the Super Nintendo, which came out in the early 90s. And just as a framework for the conversation for the Super Nintendo, these were titles like Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, which Gavin, you talked about in the first episode, Street Fighter 2. And so Gavin, I guess really quickly throwing it over to you, do you remember any of that was super influential in that SNES era, or was that not necessarily in your era?
No, I mean, I would say that's the console that got me into it first originally. That's like your Donkey Kong Country 2s, your Yoshi's World, Super Mario World, those kind of games are some of the first ones I remember playing in general.
Yeah. What was your favorite out of the ones that you mentioned? I guess outside of the nostalgia play of probably Donkey Kong Country, which one would you say your favorite?
I like Yoshi's World was good because it was like a new Mario type game, and it had some banger music in it, like the music in it's you could still listen to it today if you like that kind of Mario music, and then it introduced Yoshi as like a rideable, playable character. I would say that's probably the one that I could think of for that console.
Nice. I feel like when SNES came out for us as kids, again, I'm the youngest of 4, and my siblings were significantly older than me. So again, I wanted to be cool like them. I think the only thing that I can remember us significantly playing on the SNES was probably either Donkey Kong Country or maybe the original Mario, where you basically had to like fight. Shoot, why can't I think of his name? The donkey.
Bowser?
Well, no,
No, that was Donkey Kong.
that was
the
Donkey
original
Kong.
Donkey
Okay,
Kong.
I was thinking
game,
it was
yeah.
a different villain. You're right. Yeah, that was the original Donkey Kong.
And that's before Mario's name was Mario.
What was it before?
It was just Jumpman. Like you're talking about when it's the
Yeah,
when it's
the
the
ladders
like the
and the barrels.
girders and the ladders, yeah, and he
Mhm.
throws the flaming barrels. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
just
yeah.
that's not a Mario game. That's just Donkey Kong.
That's just Donkey Kong, not Country,
Mhm.
though.
Yeah, that's before Country. Country's when they made it into like the little platformer where you're running through the
That's
jungle.
right.
When you were Donkey Kong, the Donkey Kong game, which is funny, it's called Donkey Kong because he's like the bad guy. But
Mhm.
that is where you're playing as what became Mario, but originally was called Jumpman.
Got
And
it.
then,
The more you know.
long story short, they ended up naming him after like a landlord that was letting them back pay rent stuff, and his name was Mario, and that's how he got his name.
Interesting. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. I feel like some of the earlier area of my childhood, I don't know if you feel the same way, Gavin, but, like, I have, like, this specific, like, tunnel vision perspective of what happened in that era for me, but I don't go back and, like, revisit some of those things, so that might be interesting to do in a future episode too,
Yeah, for
like
sure.
those fun facts of the era that we didn't know probably as kids, but are interesting today as well. Cool. I think the more influential Nintendo property that came out in that time, well, not property, I should say, the console that shaped that era for me, more importantly, was like Nintendo 64, and that came out in '96. So that was when both of us were probably getting closer to what I would call like a typical gaming age, where we actually knew what we were doing instead of just button mashing. But this was like titles like Super Mario 64, Mario Kart, where I mean everybody still loves that, especially with Mario Kart World coming out on Switch 2 last year. GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Super Smash Bros. I think the one that was most influential for me in this era, I'll actually pick two. Banjo-Kazooie was one of my first platformers, I would say, in that era that I really liked, especially just because I think that was the first time we started getting cartoon platformers. I think up until that point, we had still gotten like mostly Mario was like leading the charge. And when you think of anybody character based, like cartoony, I guess, same thing with Donkey Kong. But I think Banjo
Hmm.
Kazooie was the first like unique character that popped onto the scene. And it's almost like I know we talked about Bradley the Badger last episode. I
Hmm.
think Banjo Kazooie was definitely something that Bradley the Badger was like framed behind or like built off of.
For sure. For
So
sure.
I loved Banjo Kazooie. I thought it was a fantastic game. And then they ended up coming up with like what, three additional ones as well that I feel like
That
were
sounds
really
right.
good as well. But what about you, Gavin? I talked about the other one that was influential with Donkey Kong 64 last
Yeah.
episode, so I talk about that one, but that's another one that's influential in this era too.
I would say for me, it'd probably be Super Mario 64. It's the first like truly 3D platforming game. And
Yeah,
it's still, I mean, there's still a whole community of people that play that game to this day. Like we're talking about speedrunning. We did talk about speedrunning last week. And there's still people to this day that are trying to get that game beat as fast as humanly possible. And like they still play the game, and it's 20, almost 30 years old at this point.
right.
And yeah, so that's definitely one of them. I would say Super Smash Brothers is one that I would say would probably be my second one because it was like the first fighting game I played. It's more of a party style fighting game, but it's definitely one of the first ones I played. So those would probably
Yeah.
be my two.
I have a quick question for you, sidebar on this
Hmm.
too. When you were in college, did you guys ever play like either Super Smash for like late nights, or did you play like Mario Kart as friends in like a college dorm room setting? Because I feel like that was like a big thing where I
Yeah.
went to school. And obviously there was probably drinking involved too, just to be transparent. But like, what about you though, Gavin? Like, was that a
Yeah,
pretty influential game in college too?
yeah. Yeah, it definitely came back. That I was gonna say, Super Smash Brothers. We played Melee, which is more of a GameCube title, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. But we did play Mario Kart. We played a version called Beerio Kart, where you drink a beer, but the one caveat is you cannot drink while you're driving because drinking and driving is bad. So you do have to drink while your car is not moving. So somewhat safe. But yeah, no, it definitely did make a somewhat resurgence in my college age as well, which we'll get to in a couple episodes for sure.
Yep, for sure. For sure. Cool. This is kind of cool too. The Game Boy era. So for those not familiar, Game Boy actually started in 1989 when I was doing some research, but this was like I would say the bigger kind of brick style Game Boy that a lot of people didn't actually get their hands on. I feel like more people got involved, at least in our generation, with the Game Boy Color, and then obviously the Game Boy Advance shortly after that. And then also, I think I still have one, but the Game Boy Advance SP, so like the flip version, which I think primarily what I use the Game Boy for, and I'd be curious what your feedback is too, Gavin, but this was where like Pokemon truly busted into the scene with things like Pokemon Red and Blue. Those are probably the greatest of all time, in my opinion. Probably just going to say it's a nostalgia play. But there was also Pokemon Gold and Silver, Pokemon Yellow. Obviously, this is the 30th anniversary of Pokemon starting this year. So we'll be interesting to reflect back on those more deeply in a future episode, I'm sure. But I just remember when I grew up with the Game Boy having like all the different accessories. You'd have like the plug-in light so you could actually see in the dark, or you and I talked about this offline, like the
Yeah.
magnifying glasses you could put on top of your Game Boy so you could see it in bigger fashion. But what was your experience like with the Game Boy, Gavin? What was like
Yeah.
the game for you on Game Boy?
I would say obviously it is probably your Pokemons, but before Pokemon really came out, I feel like the Game Boy was used as a way to put the old school cabinet arcade games in the
Sure. Yep.
handheld and make them portable, because that's kind of like they had a similar capabilities graphics wise. So you would play those like Tetris, Pac-Man, the original Donkey Kong that like,
Hmm.
that we had just talked about.
Yep.
It was originally that, and then I I mean, maybe this is just my opinion on this, but I feel like until like games like Pokemon and some other kind of games in that era, like that time frame came out, that's what opened up the capabilities of people being like, oh, you can just make a game that's made for handheld capabilities, and then it truly can be a game console of its own, not just a place where you put old games. But yeah, Pokemon's probably the number one in the handheld for me. Like, I mean, I still play it to this day. It's still fun. It's still great. Like I think my favorite one of all the Pokemon games would be like the Gold, Silver, Crystal.
Oh, really?
I've got a
Okay.
story. Yeah, I've got a story. I've got a story about that we can get into in a little bit here. But yeah, those ones are probably my favorite. But yeah, Pokemon's, if any other answer than Pokemon is crazy for me.
No,
So
I agree. I honestly don't know that I had many Game Boy games outside of Pokemon now that I really think about it. Because I feel like in that era too, like Pokemon did a really good job of like at least every year, every 2 years, they would have some level of Pokemon edition coming out.
mhm.
Obviously, starting with the originals, like the red and blue, and then obviously yellow came out shortly after that. And then Pokemon Gold and Silver. And then later, also, you had like your Leaf Greens, your Fire Reds, all those different ones too. So it really started like a catalyst and a jumping point for Pokemon into the what I would probably call a cultural sensation, at least here in the US. Japan had
Uh,
probably been
it was
there well
worldwide.
before. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was worldwide. I'm starting the research for the Pokemon Day episode that we're planning to do here in about the end of next month. It's crazy how much that's gone through. But they had so many games on handheld. I mean, most of the games I had were Pokemon games, but they weren't even just regular Pokemon. I had like Pokemon Pinball,
Hmm.
where it was literally just pinball with Pokemon. There's a Pokemon trading card game. So they came out with the trading card game, but this is a game where you play the trading card game in the game.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, they had all sorts of spin-off games and stuff as well. It was really, really cool.
Yeah. And not to detract us too much too, but going back to 64 really quick, I didn't include this in the original list because I wanted to talk about it, but just talking about Pokemon recollected this for me. Did you ever play Pokemon Stadium on 64?
I thought you were going to say a different one, but yeah, Pokemon Stadium was very fun. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That one was a lot of fun to me because I think that was the first time you got to see Pokemon, at least from what I remember, in like a 3D format versus like the flat black and white like we had for several
Mhm.
years, or
Yeah.
black and gray. I don't know exactly what you'd say, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like the 3D animations of everything was super cool. So,
Yeah. It was the first time outside like the anime. Like if you watched
yeah.
the show, you kind of got to see it. I mean, it's still 2D, so you're not seeing it 3D. So yeah, the 64 is like the first one. I thought you were going to say this one. I liked this game a little bit more, was Pokemon Snap.
I was gonna say that
The
was the
one where
secondary
you're
one too.
the
Yeah.
one where you're on the tracks and you're taking pictures of Pokemon in the wild. And that to me was one of the coolest games on
Hmm.
that, just because you got to see the Pokemon in their natural environment, and it felt like you're Steve Irwin
Yeah.
just going through the wilderness. Oh, there's a Volto up here.
Yeah. And
And
you
you
take a
take a picture
picture.
of it. Yeah.
Didn't it have like some kind of crazy sound and noise? Like when you would take a picture, it would be like, I don't even know. It was like a
It
positive
made a
feedback
really
loop.
loud shutter. It was a really
Yeah.
loud shutter noise. Yeah.
Yeah. And then at the end, it would do like a recap of like your best photos and
Mhm.
give you
And it would
scoring.
score you.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. No, I liked that game too. That was pretty fun. Actually tried to play that probably later last year. Was with my sister bought the Nintendo Switch Online package, but it also includes like Nintendo 64. You can play SNES
Yeah.
games and all like the retro games. And I don't subscribe to it on my own Nintendo, but I did play it on hers, and we played Pokemon Snap. And I will say, like, it doesn't age very well, but it was definitely a good game at the time.
Yeah. I mean, they came out with a new one for the Switch
Or did they?
about 2-ish years ago,
Hmm.
and
Did you play it?
I actually haven't. I don't know. I couldn't give you a good reason why. It just didn't happen. But I'd be interested to play it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe that's a future book club recommendation that we can make whenever we get that
Yeah.
off the ground too. Cool.
Yeah.
Sweet. The last thing for the Nintendo consoles of that era was the GameCube in 2001. I actually did not have a GameCube, but I was always jealous of all my friends that did, namely the ones that really like wowed me at the time. And shout out to my friend Morton, who actually got me to play GameCube when I was over at his house. But Super Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime was a big one there. I remember being so jealous that I couldn't take Super Mario Sunshine back home to play on my own. Cause like there was that specifically like that water gun that you could play with as Mario
Mhm.
that always stick out in my head as far as Super Mario Sunshine. But I guess Gavin, what's the other games that you had access to with the GameCube, and did you have one of your own?
But yeah, I had a GameCube. I think I have 2 currently. Just
Really?
yeah, I just have purchased them over the years. I think it's the best console ever made. I just think it combined a lot of things that it did them well, and it's just the GOAT console as far as I'm concerned. And it probably has 3 of my favorite games of all time on it. One of them being Super Mario Sunshine. The music, the setting, the gameplay, great. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is probably
Okay.
my favorite Zelda game on there. And the same thing, the art style is one of the first cell shaded games. The music, I mean, I still listen to some of the songs from that game. And then the third game that I would say would be Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which is the sequel to the Nintendo 64 one. That might be my favorite game of all time.
Wow.
It's
Not just
just
the
an art.
Nintendo all
Yeah,
time.
it just might be my favorite. It might be. I'd have to sit there and think about it, but I know it's on the short list right now.
Hmm. All right. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. So just to recap the Nintendo timeline there, we talked about Game Boy probably being the first one actually with 1989, and then going back up to SNES that came out in the 90s, 1990, I should say. Nintendo 64, then the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and then the GameCube came out around all the same time. So just think about what would be probably like 12-ish years of just how much innovation came out into the scene just purely from Nintendo and how big of a powerhouse they were. Naturally, though, I think there was a transition to another Japanese studio or conglomerate, I should say, with the PlayStation era. So, Gavin, I know when we talked in the first episode, there was one specific PlayStation 1 title that was very influential to you. Well, actually, there was more than one. Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider, which were obviously in this era of 94 when PlayStation 1 first came out to the scene. But there are other impressive titles like Tekken came out that same time frame in that era. Resident Evil came out in that time frame, which was also a big step forward in the horror genre. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1, and I believe 2 came out on PlayStation 1 as well. But any titles that you want to talk about specifically with PlayStation 1 outside of Crash and Tomb Raider, Gavin?
Yeah, I covered those pretty good last week, and I think it for sure Crash Bandicoot. I think you and I should make a whole episode on just those platformers of the
Right.
PlayStation era,
Yep.
so that we don't really need to deep dig too further into those. But I would say Tony Hawk Pro Skater. I mean, again, I apparently I'm learning a lot about that myself. His big thing was music for me, but
Right.
just it's one of the first video games to use licensed music, like because every other game like kind of composed music and stuff
Right.
like that,
You're
and
right.
this just they kind of contacted skaters and were like, "What music like they put the pro skaters in that they wanted to have it, and they're like, "What music would you want to be in it?" And then they just contacted bands that they were requested and put them in it, and I mean, it's just a fun game. I don't know. It made skateboarding cool. Like skateboarding was always cool, but it made it
Yeah,
more
yeah.
accessible for people that are bad. Like I wasn't good at skating, but I liked it, and so playing this was like a way to skate without skating kind of thing.
No, I agree. I think Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 was probably the first time too that a lot of people were exposed to skateboarding outside of like the people that, had already been doing it for the time being and whatever. But I also think that warehouse level will always stick out in my brain as probably one of the best levels in video games just because it's the most iconic, I think. Even with the recent remakes when they did 1 and 2, I think that was the first thing that I was excited to jump back into that I could remember of the levels. And I know a lot of people still do like high scoring runs on any of those Tony Hawk Pro Skater games to basically go into like an arcade style of skating, which we could talk about this too. There's a big argument in the gaming community, skaters specifically that are also gamers, where some people prefer Tony Hawk Pro Skater type skating games versus there's the people that like to play skate instead because it's more quote unquote realistic. I guess, Gavin, really quickly there, I've got my own opinion. I think I would swing towards Tony Hawk's Pro Skater just because that's probably what I grew up with and you more used to. But do you have an opinion on
I
skate,
mean,
I guess?
the skate is if what you want is a realistic, like what it's really like to skate, then skate does a good job.
Yeah.
But something about being able to go up a ramp and go 35 feet in the air, do 16 kick flips and a backflip while listening to pop punk and ska punk music just does it
Hmm.
for me.
Yeah.
Like you can't beat that. I don't know. Realism be damned.
No, I agree. I agree. Cool, cool. So that was the PlayStation 1. I would say for me too, just before we jump into PlayStation 2, which is funny that it was in that same era as well when we look back on it, there was this game that I can remember in that era called Bomberman. Did you ever play Bomberman, Gavin?
Yeah, Bomberman on 64. Yeah, Bomberman 64 was great.
Well, I think it was on the PlayStation as well, correct?
Was it?
I
I
thought
remember
so.
playing Bomberman 64 and it was great.
Okay.
You run around with you're talking about like the big guys with like the roundish heads and the little fuse coming out.
Yep,
That's what
yep,
you're
yep.
Yeah, I played it on the 64.
Mm,
It might have been on PlayStation, but I remember playing Bomberman 64.
I think you're right, actually. Let's see. No, it was on PlayStation 1 too, but I can see what you're talking about. There is a Bomberman 64 as well. So that's
Okay.
interesting.
That's what I played and I remember playing. It was on
Yeah.
specifically on the 64.
Yeah, maybe this was like the second rendition of Bomberman or whatever. But for those not familiar, Bomberman was kind of like an obscure, kind of quasi 3D cartoon style game, I guess is what I would constitute it as. And it's a levels based game where essentially you would go through a maze and you'd have to strategically place bombs in places to defeat enemies as well as the bosses as well. And there's one specific one that I can remember where like it's a bunny that you're basically fighting and he's jumping all around the map and you basically have to time it strategically. So you're like, okay, he's going to jump in this area in 2 seconds. So I got to jump. I got to put the bomb there right now and then it'll explode 3 seconds while he's still standing there. It was crazy. It was kind of stupid now that I'm like talking about it out loud, but it definitely holds like a special place in my own gaming background. I just loved it. And I also think it was one of those like cool games as well, because if you watch just the intro alone before you, like when you're firing up the game, it goes through like a lava level. It goes through like this super tropical level and like this dusty dust storm level that you can go through. And so I think that was really cool to me in being able to be picky about which specific level that you could play. And like, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I thought like the art style at the time was really cool, given how unique of a game I thought it was when I was playing it.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. PlayStation 2 era. This was probably my favorite. And I don't know if you would say the same to Gavin, knowing that you're more of a Nintendo player now, but in the PlayStation 2 era, it came out in 2000. And in my opinion, I think for the 90s to the early 2000s, this was the greatest of all time console, I think, in terms of just at least the amount of consoles that were sold in that time frame. I can go double check that later, but there were titles like Final Fantasy X, Jack and Daxter, which we've talked about in a previous episode, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper, my absolute favorite, God of War, and then also Grand Theft Auto Vice City came out in the PlayStation 2 era too. I think the one that I want to talk about more deeply in another episode is Sly Cooper, and I'll definitely get you into that, Gavin, once we revisit that, maybe as like a
Mhm.
I can tell you about it, and then you can tell me what your experience is about playing it in 2026.
Yeah.
But I would also say the other game from the PlayStation 2 era that was pretty influential to me was actually Vice City. I don't think I should have been playing Vice City as a kid, but I certainly did. And I think the only reason why I had my hands on it was because my brother is 5 years older than me. So he was, let's say, eligible to play that game at the time. And I was just like the dorky brother that wanted to play as well. But talking about video game soundtracks, I think that was the first one that I was really like, I didn't know those were real songs until I listened to them later. And like I would hear like super popular 80s songs, 90s songs, like, and you would be able to flip through the radio stations. I remember that distinctly too. But I think in that era, Grand Theft Auto Vice City definitely had one of the best soundtracks that I can recall. But any of those other titles, do they stand out to you, Gavin, that you would want to talk about deeper in that PlayStation 2 era?
I like the Grand Theft Auto. I had a similar experience with you where I mean I didn't know they were real songs, and then you'll just hear it on the
Hmm.
radio and you're like, wait a minute, that's from
Hmm.
Grand Theft Auto. Yeah, I mean we kind of talked at length last episode about your Jack and Daxters, your Ratchets, your Sly Coopers, your Crash Bandicoots, all of that. I mean, since we kinda hit Sly Cooper and the Crash, I'll say Ratchet& and Clank.
Yeah,
Those were similar style games. Those are great. That would probably be my one standout for the PlayStation 2. The one that we haven't previously covered.
agreed. And I think one of the things that we were talking about yesterday as a preparation for the show was how influential those developers specifically still are today. Ratchet and Clank, for those that aren't familiar, Insomniac made those games. Sly Cooper, again, my favorite, was developed by Sucker Punch Studios. And then Jack and Daxter was created by Naughty Dog. So if you think about just the amount of those three developers have still in the video game industry, not naming just those games, but like going back to Insomniac, that was the most recent Spider-Man that came out that I think just blew everybody away in terms of just kind of like a love letter to the cartoon and also the comic book series as well, and also taking
Mhm.
some creative liberties too, which I feel like were well received in the community. As far as Sly Cooper's Sucker Punch Studios, they're still making games as well. That was the ones that created like Ghost of Tsushima and also Ghost of Yote, which both were well received as well. Believe they're also coming out with a new game soon too. And then also with Jack and Daxter, going back to Naughty Dog, that was where they had probably the best pedigree, I would say, of the video game developers, where they had The Last of Us, they had Uncharted, which I believe was one of the best series in video games, and then also Gavin, your favorite, Crash Bandicoot. So I
True.
think, and Naughty Dog is going to be coming out with a new game as well. They announced it. I can't remember exactly what they coined it as, like the name, but I'm excited to see what each of those developers continues to bring as we head into 2026 and beyond. But anything specific, Gavin, there that you want to talk about with those pedigree of studios or anything like that?
I mean, it's just amazing how they've turned how they didn't just keep making the 3D platformers. Like they kind of
Right.
just
Didn't
started
rest on their
making
laurels.
yeah, and like they continued to make games that they liked. And I need to play the Ghost of Tsushima series. Like I need to play both those games because I know they're really good, but I
Yeah.
haven't played them. But yeah, I mean, other than just thanks for making Crash Bandicoot and Sly Cooper those games because those are awesome. Like,
Yeah, totally agree. And hopefully they continue to make great games. I think one of the things that sets them apart, and I'd love your feedback on this too, is like I think those studios have not fallen prey to chasing whatever's in the mainstream and being popular. They basically do what they think is best, and they trust the people that they have on staff to be creative, take creative liberties, but also keep things fun, which I think a lot of video game developers right now, at least, aren't doing. I feel like everybody is chasing the Fortnites of the world where they want something that's endlessly playable, that's quote unquote free to play, but also has tons and tons of microtransactions so they can continuously get money from the gamers in the world. I think each of those developers that we brought up, none of them, to my knowledge, have created a free to play game in the first place. I don't think. You can fact
I'm
check me
not
there.
sure. I'll say I'm not sure on that either.
Yeah, we'll double check that, but I don't think they have. But I think, again, the creativity, the pedigree they bring to the table has been always refreshing, I guess, let's say, in the video game industry for sure. Cool. And then the last thing we would be remiss not to talk about is actually Xbox busting onto the scene. So Microsoft was in 2001, they brought Xbox to market. That was the first time that they had really gotten involved in any kind of capacity with video games, unless you think of like video game themselves, not consoles though. But they had titles like Halo, Splinter Cell, Jet Set Radio Future, Halo 2, Knights of the Old Republic, Fable, Ninja Gaiden, a lot of those which are still properties and titles that carry through today, especially going back to PlayStation really quick. Halo is actually going to be releasing on PlayStation 5 sometime this year, I believe.
Wait, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's a big push right
That's
now with Microsoft, is
that's
getting
huge.
a lot of the mainline titles on Sony. They're turning more from like the exclusivity way that they have been running the business from 2001 up until, let's say, 2022-ish. They're changing it more into like they want to be a software company, not necessarily a hardware company. That's just my own personal take on it from what I'm, reading the tea leaves and watching. But it seems like they're kind of moving away from exclusivity. Like, I think PlayStation is still kind of in that exclusivity section. I'd say Nintendo is absolutely in that exclusivity, class. But I think Xbox and Microsoft are trying to meet players where they are, and they're saying, "Hey, you don't have to be playing on an Xbox for us to get the game to you, get it in your hands." So, but any specifics out of those, Gavin, that you would want to double click into? I think Halo. You and I had talked about this
Yeah.
in a
Halo's
previous episode, I
awesome.
believe. Yeah, Halo's is fantastic, and I think you and I discussed this, like going back somewhat to GoldenEye, like how that was the first like couch co-op type games that we would play in the era, like the multiplayer genre. I think Halo and Halo 2 were definitely the more like, I guess,
Oh, yeah.
sophisticated multiplayer, would you say? Where we'd still
Yeah,
have
it
like the LAN parties and things like that, but a little bit different than the GoldenEye era.
felt like GoldenEye felt more like a party type game where you're like the
Yeah,
whole goal is to like be there and have fun. And when you're Halo and your Halo 2s, it still had that party and LAN type event, but it's one of the first games that's like truly aside that it's one of the first console games that's like truly got online and competitive, and like it was more you still multiplayer, but it got competitive with the multiplayer. Like on PC, you've had that for years at that point with your like StarCrafts and your original Counter Strikes, like Source and stuff like that. But yeah, Halo is one of the first Halo and like because that Halo and Call of Duties are like your first like
yeah.
real competitive multiplayer games on console.
Right. And when I was doing research for this episode too, I was almost not going to include Xbox because at the time, like, I don't know if you felt the same way, Gavin. I didn't really have exposure to Xbox proper, like the first one that came out. I had friends that had it, and that's the only reason why I had exposure to it. I think more so when I got exposed to Xbox, it was Xbox 360 and One and Xbox Series X and all those different ones. But I think when I was looking back on the research, Xbox was also the first one to bring like Xbox Live to the table
Mm-hmm.
too. At that point, nobody had been doing anything online wise, and I think that's mostly true because if I'm remembering right, PlayStation 2 did have some level of like quote unquote online, but it wasn't like for multiplayer purposes, if I'm remembering correctly.
So they both the GameCube and the PlayStation 2, like GameCube, you had to get a whole separate accessory that would plug into
Eh,
the bottom of the it would plug into the bottom of the GameCube to where you could jack in a Ethernet cable. And then the PlayStation 2 also had like an Ethernet plug on the back, but they didn't really have true online services. Like there's some stuff you could do with it. But yeah, Halo or the Xbox was really the first system that had like online competitive games, like from a console standpoint. And I was lucky enough to have I had an X I've had all the I had all of the consoles as a kid, so I was lucky enough to have exposure to all of it.
nice,
And that
nice.
big, bulky original Xbox controller that, like, even today, like, is a little too big for your hands, where
Right.
the buttons weren't spaced out well, it was just bad.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that you bring up the controller specifically too, because if I'm thinking about form factors, starting with like the SNES, it was very flat, right? Like it was a very flat controller with like protruding buttons, and it was okay. I mean, it wasn't super comfortable, but it was fine. And then you move into Nintendo 64 and it had like the unique handle that nobody had seen before with like specifically the joystick, as well as like, I don't know if you felt this way at the time though. Like you had three handles, but obviously you only have two hands. So like, do you put it in the middle? Do you put it on the left? Yeah, exactly.
I always ignored the left one. It was
Yeah,
middle and right.
exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought too. And then obviously the Z buttons and behind um
Yeah.
the Nintendo 64. Same thing with GameCube. I thought GameCube had a very unique controller base too. I feel like everybody was just trying to figure out what was the best. But on that note, I will say PlayStation has held pretty true to the original controller if you think about it. Like the PlayStation controller, PlayStation 1 controller is the same as PlayStation 2, maybe slightly different in terms of
It didn't
form
originally
factor.
have it didn't have the joysticks originally.
But it
That's the
didn't.
biggest difference. Mm-mm.
Okay.
Original
Because I,
PlayStation only had
yeah,
like later on, like towards the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, they
it
added the
changed it.
joysticks and
Okay.
then they added like the vibration, but the original PlayStation controller was just your two handles button or your arrow buttons and then your square, circle, triangle, and X.
Well, you're right. I do see it now. Okay, wow. I didn't even realize that. Okay. But still, like the same form factor
Yeah, it's
as far
they
as
definitely kept the same
the
like
OG.
ergonomic feel in your hand.
Yeah. And obviously, PlayStation 2 made a subtle switch to that, made those joysticks permanent in terms of the controller. And then PlayStation 3 didn't really have much of a change. PlayStation 4 did. It kind of had like the rounded feel to it, but still like pretty similar form factor. And I'd say PlayStation 5 controllers are a little bit bulkier than they used to be, but they're still pretty much the same. I feel like PlayStation kind of fell into like, let's not broke what's not fixed? So
Yeah.
I think it's just interesting though. You look at all those different consoles and how different their controllers were between each of them. Even
I
Xbox, like I feel like
mean,
Xbox is still the oversized controller. More, it's bigger than all the other ones that I know of, at least in the
yeah.
console space.
I mean, Nintendo kind of just I think they have a rule where you can't have the same controller twice or something because
Yeah,
they
the
kind of if
Wiimote.
you look at it, yeah, the Wiimote, then they added the nunchuck and then
Hmm.
they tried the Wii U. They basically put an iPad in between a controller for the Wii U and then that which kinda was a Switch before the Switch, and then with the Switch, the detachable
Hmm.
Joy-Cons are kinda like a Wiimote, but they're a little bit different, and I will say with the Switch 2, it's definitely been nice because the
The pop out
Joy-Cons were built bigger. Well, the pop-out one is
mechanism.
it's just a
Yeah.
satisfying yeah, it's just a satisfying sound, but, it's just they're bigger, so, like,
Hmm.
you play with it you can play with the Joy-Cons in hand, and it doesn't feel like you're, like, curling up your hands to try to play with it.
Right. Which maybe in a future episode, I'll talk a little bit about potentially getting a Switch 2. I'd love your feedback on that too, Gavin. Like you've obviously had a Switch 2 for a while. I still have the original Switch 1 and I can't bring myself to get a Switch 2. I don't play Switch as much as I probably should try to, given how many awesome games are on there, especially Donkey Kong Bonanza. That's something that I want to play at some
Yeah.
point. But yeah, maybe we can table that for a future episode too. Just like Switch 2 reactions. What do you like?
Yeah,
What do you hate? Would you recommend upgrading? Those kinds of things.
for sure.
Cool, cool. All right. So let's go through a quick recap of like just more of those non-Nintendo consoles that we just talked about. So PlayStation 1 breaking out into the scene of 1994 with titles like Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil, etc. PlayStation 2, which I think was really the 3D platformer launch era, I think, with titles like Jack and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, Sly and Cooper, again, that we've talked about in previous episodes. And then lastly, the Xbox in the 2001 era. Anything that we think we want to revisit, Gavin, out of those lists of consoles, or anything that we didn't mention as far as like noteworthy games that we want to talk about?
Aside from getting into our eras, no, like, I've got some stuff that I'll talk about when we get into our specific things, but other than that, no, I think we did a pretty good job of doing a somewhat brief overview of all of the consoles.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Cool. Yeah. And I think I said this before, but I think we were eating good as kids, just looking back on all those different revolutionary video game consoles and games that were busting out into the scene. I think everybody was being very innovative at the time and creative, and that definitely shone through. It's not something that you probably see as much today. There was a lot of risks being taken back then, which I appreciate. And honestly, I was very excited to talk to you about this specific era because I think this is probably one of the more meatier topics that we can talk about, obviously, with our childhood, because there was less responsibilities back then and we wanted to just play video games. But Gavin, I guess going back to your under 10-year-old era, do you want to go through specifically like your exposure within those first, let's say 10 to 12 years? Like, what are the noteworthy games you wanted to go through in that time period?
Yeah, I'll do a run through. Won't say it's quick because it probably won't be. First consoles I really played on where I kind of touched upon in the last episode, but it was PlayStation 1 and your SNES with the Donkey Kong Country 2, your Super Marios, your Crash, your Jack and Daxter. Like I said, mostly in that area. In that era, I was playing whatever my grandma was playing because I wanted to spend time with her. So whatever she'd play, I'd play. And with those games in particular, we would always alternate lives. So like I would play a life, die, then hand over the controller. Or if she was just playing and she got mad, she would hand me the controller and I'd beat the little section she couldn't beat, and then I hand it back over. So that was like my first like sub eras, like those with those consoles. And then I remember I didn't actually have a 64. But I did play it frequently at a friend's house and whatnot. But so I did play your Golden Eyes, your Mario Kart 64, all those. I did play those, but I didn't play those a lot until like later, like a lot until later. So really, the next console I really remember having was like a PlayStation 2 and a GameCube. And as I said earlier, I think the GameCube is the best console ever made. I mean, it has three of my favorite games of all time. Like I said, Super Mario Sunshine, which came out in the summer of 2002, Wind Waker, which came out that December, and those like were pseudo launch titles. Like they came out with with the GameCube itself. I mean, Super Mario Sunshine, it's Mario on a summer beach type of vacation, running around with a jetpack on his back, but it's sprays water because you're cleaning up paint. Because the main antagonist is covering the whole island in paint, and so that's pretty much it. Music's great. It's Mario gameplay while being new, but it still feels like a Mario game. Nothing's new there. Like pretty much the same type of story. A Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. That is like your typical Zelda type game where you're a young protagonist that's been tasked with trying to save the world essentially, but instead of being your normal Zelda game like your Ocarina of Time and your Majora's Mask where you're running around the place, it's the whole world is like basically been flooded and you have to sail everywhere on a sailboat, and just the sailing music in it's great. Like I said earlier, it's one of the first cell shaded games and has a really unique art style that's cartoonish and fun. And I mean, I think between the music, the story, and the graphics, there's still some of the best games I've ever played and my favorites. The last one on the GameCube era, I would say, was Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which is a JRPG style game. It's obviously it's Mario, and I really like the art direction, the writing, and the story. Again, the music, the gameplay. It's your turn based, Japanese RPG type game, but it's all Mario characters. It's goofy. You're a piece of like the whole thing leans into the fact that all of the characters are 2D pieces of paper, and there's like fun jokes within that. So that's pretty much my GameCube. And then obviously the Pokemon bug caught that pretty hard in that era. I remember playing Red and Blue and Yellow, which I remember liking Yellow the most out of those because it felt like the show when I watched it as a
Yeah.
kid. But the game I actually have the most fondness for is Crystal, which
Mm-hmm.
came out in like the summer of 2001. And the reason is because the story of how I got it is just goofy. So I was with my family. We were at this like lakeside water park where it's like, like a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of stuff. And there's this like, I don't know how there's like a cliff you could run off of and jump into the lake. And it was the highest one. And I'm 9 years old. I don't remember exactly how high it was. It felt like it was 50 feet. And I had tried to do it earlier in the day and I chickened out because it was too high. Well, my mom had said at some point in the day, well, if you jump off that, I'll buy that game you've been wanting. And I think she genuinely thought I wouldn't do it because I chickened out. And then, so by the end of the day, I'm like, all right, I gotta do this. I gotta do this. So I got up to the thing, I closed my eyes, and I just ran off of the cliff and like into the lake. And then she's like, she owned up. she's a woman of her word and bought me the game, but I truly think she did not think I was gonna do it, and that's why she said she would buy me the game. And so because of that, Crystal is like my favorite Pokemon game of that era specifically.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you remember how
Yeah.
high that cliff was?
Like I said, it was probably like 10 to 12 feet, but as a
Okay.
9-year-old, it felt like 50. Like it wasn't anything crazy, but like as a 9-year-old, you look down, it's like in the cartoon when it zooms out and it's like, yeah, that's a
Mhm.
50-foot cliff. I mean, it's probably not higher than 10 to maybe highest 15-foot cliff, but it was, yeah, it was the highest one they had there. And yeah, it was just
Yeah.
basically my mom said I couldn't or I wouldn't do it, so I did it and then got the game.
And was that, like, the last thing that you did before you left the water park for the day? Like, did you have to, like,
It
gear
was
yourself up for it?
Oh, yeah, it was an all day, like, it was like I said, I had tried earlier in the day before she made the bet with me, and then, I psyched myself out because it was too high, and then, I'm like, "Alright, you could do this, you could do this. Do it for
Do it for the
Pokemon, do it for
crystal.
Pokemon." Yeah, exactly, do it for Pokemon, and then you just close your eyes and just run
Yeah.
off the freaking thing, and then I don't know what happened, I ended up in the lake. My eyes were closed.
And you were
Coulda done
fine.
flip. Yeah, coulda done a flip, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's pretty much I would say for the era we're talking about, that's the biggest hitting points I have on those eras.
Nice. Nice. Love that. Cool. Some of this is going to be like a recollection of what we've already talked about too. But for me, the under 10-year-old era, I think it started for me mostly with the Nintendo 64, as we mentioned. I think that was the first time that I was young enough to know what I was doing versus just taking a controller and acting like I was playing. So in those eras, that was Donkey Kong 64 that we've talked about. I just really loved the art style and the story back then too. I loved that you could play multiple of the Kong brothers and sisters, and it had like a really cool villain at the time too. And also, I liked how just a bunch of these characters came and how they interacted with each other and everything. I also liked the fact that you could change who you played as too. I think up until that point, that was the only game that you could really change the character that you were playing as, at least for me in my exposure, being able to switch between Diddy and obviously Donkey Kong, and I can't remember exactly what the sister's name is, but you get the gist of it. Just a really fun
Mhm.
game. And it was also one of the first games I can remember back in that era. We had memory cards, and people would always fight. People, as in my siblings, would always fight on who gets the memory card and who could actually have like their save file be saved. And I actually remember a couple times I accidentally deleted the siblings' save data. So, oops. But just something funny that you wouldn't think about today in this era of video games, especially with a lot of like saves going into sometimes the cloud with like Steam games
Yeah.
and things like that. So the other one was GoldenEye 007. You and I had talked at length about this, but I think the coolest thing about that era or that game for the time was just how insanely fun the game was. Like, you didn't even have to really know that much about James Bond to know that it was just like a really cool spy game. But looking back on it, it had terrible art. Like, I tried to play it like back in the day. Everything's pixelated, nothing was well defined. The character models were very rigid, but at the time it was a lot of fun to play, especially localized multiplayer that you could play with like friends, siblings, etc.
Yeah.
You could play as Bond, Natalia, Boris, and some others. And also, when I was
Odd
doing
Job?
an odd job, exactly, just really iconic characters. When I was doing research for the podcast, I also realized Robbie Coltrane was in 007. Did you know that? Like Hagrid from Harry Potter. He was actually in the game as
Genuinely
well.
did not know that. It
I didn't
doesn't
know that either.
surprise me as a British actor being in that, it doesn't surprise me, but that is really cool to find out. RIP.
Yeah. Exactly, that's what I was gonna say. Just a fantastic actor in person, I think. Definitely RIP to him, because I think he made a lot of impact in my own life being a Harry Potter fan, but also secretly in other ways, like with the 007. I had no idea that Haggard was a secret agent, you know? The other, consoles of that era too that I had exposure to as well, being a PlayStation fanboy at the time, was PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. I actually have them literally right behind me in my recording booth. And I still do play PlayStation 3 every once in a while with like the Sly Cooper collection. But PlayStation was really influential to me because that's probably the first thing, again, that I got exposed to outside of Nintendo properties with Nintendo 64. But again, that was the Bomberman, Spyro, Crash Bandicoots of the world. And I think at the time, again, that standout game for me was Bomberman that I can recently remember. Again, very basic concepts, but just really cool world design, really cool characters, and really cool art style as well. But I think that also, again, in that time frame of the PlayStation 1 era with the Crash Bandicoots, it really laid the foundation for some really cool 3D platformer type games that we're still enjoying today, especially in the early 2000s, which pivots directly into PlayStation 2, which I think was the most influential console of my era. And I'll be a little bit biased in this one, but I think, again, PlayStation 2 for me was the absolute go. I think it still is for me, going back, just looking at how many cool titles came to the PlayStation 2, like the Ratchet and Clanks, the Sly Coopers, the Jack and Daxter of the world. And I could talk in hours about each of those games specifically. But again, those video game developers that created those and them still being prevalent in the scene today, I think is very, very. But that's all we had to talk
Yeah.
about with our eras. This episode was definitely longer than I expected, Gavin. I don't know about you, but anything else you want to talk about that was influential in this 10-year-old and younger era for you?
I guess the only other thing I could think of is going back to like the PlayStation because I kind of just went down a Nintendo rabbit hole. I did play quite a bit of PlayStation. I did play a lot of the Jack and Daxter, your Crash Bandicoots. Obviously, I've talked ad nauseum about that at this point, but I do also remember just like weird little game. Like I played the Harry Potter tie-in games, like
Mm-hmm.
those terrible games. Like they're objectively bad games. I remember playing those that were fun. I do remember playing a Rugrats tie-in game.
Oh,
Like it was
yeah.
like a game made for like for the Rugrats show. That was fun. Yeah, those are like kind of the games I thought of as you were talking about the PlayStation. I was like, what? Because I know I played it. I was like, I needed to think of something because I felt bad only going just pure Nintendo fanboy, but I did play quite a bit of the PlayStation as well.
For sure.
And then I guess into the Xbox as well. I did play a lot of your Halo Combat Evolved. Although one of the first games I remember on the Xbox that I played, it was one of those good old combo 2 games on one disc, and it was
Oh, yeah.
Tetris Revolutions. I think is what the title was, but it was Tetris on the
Mm-hmm.
Xbox, and I remember enjoying playing that because you could download music, like any music onto your Xbox, which was the cool thing about Xbox. You would put a CD on and then you would download the stuff on. But you could play Tetris while listening. I vividly remember listening to Usher's Confessions while playing just Tetris.
Yeah.
Like, so that's I would feel bad if I didn't mention those as well. Those are the ones I had thought of while you were talking about like the PlayStation and stuff. And also the GoldenEye, we're talking about how bad the graphics were. It always felt like you're holding the gun like in the middle of your chest, which
Mm-hmm.
is like not how you would hold the gun at all. And it was just yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And actually, I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'm glad that you did with the Rugrats game. I think there was another game in that like Nickelodeon era of PlayStation 1 and
Mhm.
PlayStation 2 video games. Did you ever play Rocket Power or like watch Rocket Power as a kid?
Well, I loved Rocket Power. It
Yeah.
fed into a little bit of the Tony Hawk, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the
yeah,
extreme
Tony Hawk
sports aspect.
extreme sports adrenaline junkie of the world. You
Yep,
know,
for sure. I remember
I never
playing.
played.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just say I didn't know they did a Rocket Power game actually.
They did. They actually have two because I just did a quick search while we were talking here. There was one in PlayStation 1 era, which was
Okay.
called, let's see exactly what it was called, Team Rocket Rescue, which I don't remember playing as much, but there was more of a quasi 3D platformer style rocket power game called Beach Bandits. That was more going to be along the lines of like I think there was mountain boarding involved in it. There was obviously some skateboarding aspects, some rollerblading aspects of it too. But I believe this is something we could talk about in a future episode as well. But I believe with the Rocket Power series, this was where they were trying to basically defeat like a person that was trying to come into their city and revamp it and have like robots go everywhere. Like this is literally just going off memory, but it was a really cool game at the time. And I remember too, I
Interesting.
think my disc was like corrupted, so I could never play it again. And that was back in the time
That's
where
so
like
sad.
I know where you would have to like take it to like a video game store, like they'd scrub the crap out of it to see if they could actually get it to work again. Yeah, RIP to Rocket Power because I never got to play it again. But that might be something that we talk about in the future too. Just some of
Yeah.
those like unique cartoon spin-off games that were actually pretty good. Like there's definitely a bunch that were botched. Like we talked about with Harry Potter 1, I think on PlayStation 1, everybody can argue that that was terrible, but there was a time and place for a lot of those games, which was pretty cool. What?
I'm just laughing at thinking about how bad that Harry Potter game
It was
was.
so bad. People still make fun of Hagrid for the terrible art style he had, like with the
His
big
how
cone head.
flat his face, yeah, his face
Yeah.
was flat, but it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Cool. Well, I think this has been a great episode, Gavin. We'll wrap up here for the folks listening. This was honestly a fantastic episode just to recollect, be a little bit nostalgic about the upbringing that we each had with video games. And quite honestly, it left me with a lot of need almost to like go fire up some of those old consoles and play some of those masterpieces that we talked about today. But I think we should end here again for this week's episode. If you're enjoying what we're doing, though, please subscribe, share with a friend, drop a comment below. We'd love your feedback so that we can shape future episodes. Again, Gavin and I are just doing this because we love video games. We love trying to give back to this community and just recollecting on the positives of our own experience with video games. So stay tuned for our next podcast episode that'll be dropping in a couple weeks, where we'll dive deeper into the next era of our lives, which was those pubescent teenage years of late middle school and high school. Yikes. But anyways, thanks for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.
Yep. Thanks, guys.